Oplio. Today, on the 20th day of my action, I will speak about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, its geopolitical significance, and why the church doesn't do anything to stop it. One need only take a look at this series of maps to understand that it is primarily a land grab. In 1917, Jews owned only 3% of Palestine. By 1948, after the Nakba, Jews owned 78% of the landmass of Palestine, and the Palestinian population had already been squeezed onto just two small territories, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and today they own about 90% of the land and have reduced the Palestinian population to just 10% of their original land. Since the conflict or the extermination of the Gazan population started in 2023, Israel has seized an additional 23.7 square kilometers just from the Palestinian territories in 2024 alone. So this is a land grab, but it is also a crusade by another name. Christians effectively lost control of Jerusalem and the broader Holy Land in 1187 when Saladin kicked our asses during the Battle of Hattin. The last major Crusader stronghold, Acre, fell in 1291, marking the end of mainland Crusader presence in the Levant. 1,000 years later, the West attempts to take the Holy Land by subterfuge under the pretense of rectifying a wrong done to Jews during the Holocaust. This is the overarching objective of the Israel strategy, and it is driven by a religion and the boundless greed and power lust of the Judeo-Christian elites. But there are other lesser objectives behind it too. Objectives that I explain in my article, War of the Circumcised, the Destruction of Palestine and its Geopolitical Objectives, which I published on the 18th of December 2023, thus just 2 months after the extermination of the people of Gaza began. Let me explain. The newest operative principle of the international system is to take pre-existing conflicts that have been stuck in an unresolved state for decades and to push them over the edge to disrupt their precarious stasis and use the ensuing chaos to resolve them through the use of force, and in the process tackle several geopolitical problems behind the front provided by the said conflict. When no such opportunity exists, it is created from scratch. This modus operandi has been chosen for the 10-year plan to end the age of materialism and usher in the age of sustainability that was kickstarted in 2020 and is now entering its third phase with the destruction of Gaza and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. The mass fear, death, and sterility engineered in 2020-2021 with the COVID pandemic and mRNA vaccines constitutes the first phase of this decade-long plan. It was followed by the economic hardship, hyperinflation, and famine engineered in 2022-2023 with a false energy crisis and equally false war in Ukraine, which constitutes the second phase. The atrocities, blatant violations of moral norms and international laws, and intentional provocations to hatred and violence that began on October 7 constitute the third phase, which is engineered to cause global disruptions in 2024-2025 by triggering a war between civilizations. The first engineered crises used an illusory pandemic to stabilize the population and consumption. China took the lead role in that crisis by starting the pandemic theater and in the process became the world's scapegoat. The second engineered crisis used an illusory war to accelerate the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources, thus the decarbonization program, but also to save Europe and Russia from demographic collapse. Russia took the lead role in that crisis by presumably sabotaging its own pipelines and by invading Ukraine, and in so doing became the world's malefactor. And the third engineered crisis, the genocide in Gaza, is intended to reduce the population across the developing world, lower consumption even further across the developed world, stall the development of China and the Gulf states, and advance the decarbonization program throughout the world. The US and Israel are taking the lead role in this third engineered crisis by starting the genocide theater to turn Muslims against Jews, Christians against Muslims, and the rest of the world against Jews and Americans, and in so doing have become the world's most reviled nations and a new axis of evil. The reality, however, is that the governments of the world's largest and most powerful nations are cooperating with one another and taking turns in leading the way into yet another engineered crisis that serves as a front for accomplishing key geopolitical objectives that require the suspension of the rule of law and the violation of our inalienable rights and liberties. Without further ado, let me now list and briefly explain the many objectives pursued under the front of the system's latest deception, the destruction of Gaza, which are of two kinds: short and long-term goals. Short-term goals first. Number one, solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict once and for all, either by pushing all Palestinians out of Israel and into the neighboring countries, or by forcing both the Israelis and the Palestinians to accept a two-state solution. The US and Israel want the first outcome, while the rest of the world wants the second. But everyone wants an end to this conflict because it costs immense sums of money and never-ending human suffering. While the EU and the Gulf states are paying for the construction of infrastructure and the administrative costs of the Palestinian territories, the US and the Jewish diaspora are funding the purchase of weapons used by Israel to destroy Palestine's infrastructure and to displace Palestinians from their land to make room for illegal Israeli settlers. According to figures compiled by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, aid to Palestinians amounted to more than $40 billion between 1994 and 2020. The largest portion of this assistance, 35.4%, went to support the Palestinian Authority's budget, while the rest was allocated to various services and economic sectors in the Palestinian territories. The bulk of the aid, nearly 72%, came from 10 donors: the European Union, $18.9 billion, the United States, $14.2 billion, Saudi Arabia, $9.9 billion, Germany, $5.8 billion, the United Arab Emirates, $5.2 billion, Norway, $4.8 billion, United Kingdom, $4.3 billion, the World Bank, $3.2 billion, Japan, $2.9 billion, and France, $2.7 billion. Non-Arab donors, therefore, provided close to 77% of all aid for the period in question. Conversely, US aid to Israel from 1951 to 2022 totaled $317.9 billion, making it the largest recipient of American foreign aid since World War II. In addition, the Jewish diaspora has given Israel countless billions of dollars since its founding in 1948. Consequently, the US and Israel are deliberately making Gaza uninhabitable by destroying everything in order to send all its inhabitants into Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, as revealed by a leaked plan of the government of Israel, or to scatter them around the world, as some Israeli lawmakers have called for. To give Israel the time it needs to accomplish this, the US has vetoed any UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire, which would have been binding, while Israel is ignoring any resolution passed by the UN General Assembly, which are non-binding. The ethnic cleansing of all Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank is the preferred outcome for all parties that have been footing the bill of this intractable conflict, as that would shift the cost of caring for the Palestinian people to the Muslim countries that would take them in, primarily Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon, and who in return would be forgiven part of their debt and receive economic backing from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. 2. Reduce the population of both Israel and Palestine to a more sustainable number by killing a lot of people and subsequently sterilizing both populations until their total fertility rates drop below 2 children per woman, where they will be kept through poisoning with endocrine disruptors for decades to come, as it is being done to the rest of the global population. The Israelis and the Palestinians have for decades tried to outbreed each other in case a one-state solution becomes viable and every vote would count equally in a democracy. As a result, the populations of Israel and Palestine have each grown tenfold since 1948. Let me repeat that. They have grown tenfold since 1948, reaching about 7 million each today and far surpassing the ability of the land to support such a large population sustainably. According to the Overshoot Index 2016, Israel is only 5.6% self-sufficient and can only support at most 500,000 of its 7 million people. As for the Palestinian territories, which number 3.3 million people in the West Bank and 2.3 million in the Gaza Strip, they are almost entirely dependent on the outside world, especially since the Israelis have continuously stolen Palestinian land and deprived the Palestinians of any means of self-subsistence. Although the Palestinian total fertility rate has decreased from nearly 8 children per woman in the 1960s to 3.4 today, and the Israeli total fertility rate has declined from 4.5 children per woman in 1950 to 3 today, their fertility rates have yet to reach replacement level, let alone sub-replacement level, which is what all UN member states have by mutual coercion mutually agreed upon. As a result, both Israel and the Palestinian territories are grossly overpopulated and represent a growing food burden on the world that the international community is no longer willing to tolerate, let alone bear. The Palestinians are being forced into a sustainable population by Israeli aggression and brutality, and the world will soon force Israel into a sustainable population, most likely also by military aggression and brutality. The demographic aspect of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict also makes the ethnic cleansing of Gaza the preferred outcome for the international community, since their sterilization to replacement level fertility would be accomplished by the same methods used by the countries that would take them in, namely Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon, which have total fertility rates of 3.1, 2.7, and 2 children per woman respectively, and who would benefit from the largesse of the international system at a time when all three are in economic dire straits. This explains the absolute silence from the West and the unprecedented lack of action from the institutions tasked with maintaining international peace and security, the UN Security Council, preventing war, the UN system, taking action against human rights violations, the UN Human Rights Council, and punishing war crimes, the International Criminal Court. 3. Stop the flow of oil from the Persian Gulf, which produces 32% of the world's oil and possesses 38.4% of the world's total proven natural gas reserves. This will cause an energy crisis, which will in turn cause hyperinflation and lower consumption and emissions, therefore aiding the decarbonization program. It is, in other words, a new way of triggering the same cycle of hardship as with the pandemic in 2020-21 and with the false war in Ukraine in 2022-2023. The Red Sea and Suez Canal corridor is already being shut down by Yemen's Houthis, and soon the Strait of Hormuz will be shut down by the US, who will undoubtedly engineer a false flag event, such as the attack of an oil tanker, for which Iran will be promptly blamed, since no Arab nation has yet intervened militarily to stop the carnage in Gaza, despite the over-the-top provocations and the indiscriminate bombing of the civilian population by Israel that has so far resulted in 20,000 deaths. That was in 2023. By now, 60,000 people have been killed. 70% of them women and children. And thousands more buried under the rubble, as well as more than 100,000 people severely injured and crippled. That the US is getting ready for war is made plainly evident by the naval forces it sent to the region. That, once again, I wrote this in 2023. We see that now repeated in 2025 because the US did succeed in starting a war against Iran by directly attacking its so-called nuclear processing facilities. Now, further clear evidence that the US-Israel-EU alliance wants a war in the Middle East is furnished by their machinations to prevent the passing of a binding resolution at the UN Security Council that would stop the demolition of Gaza and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. To silence the International Criminal Court, which has yet to issue any indictments against any Israeli government and military members. This, in the meantime, has happened, but nobody has acted on them, so and Netanyahu and his criminal cabinet members have yet to be arrested. And to inactivate the UN Human Rights Council, which has remained completely silent on the atrocities committed by Israel in Gaza. This continues to be the case. Similarly, none of the UN agencies or NGOs are allowed to provide anything other than a trickle of aid to the 1.8 million Palestinians who have been displaced and are now starving, sleeping outdoors, suffering of infectious diseases, and are forced to drink seawater. In the meantime, there's no aid whatsoever. To add insult to injury, the UN World Food Programme has yet to issue a report on the state of the Palestinian people, even though half of them are facing starvation, and the WFP itself has declared a catastrophic hunger crisis on December 5th. The hunger crisis, in the meantime, is far worse than then, and still nobody does anything about it. The most convincing evidence that the US and Israel want to spark a war in the region is the impunity with which they violate all international laws and moral norms, and the even greater impunity with which they advertise their violations. Now, they are doing their utmost to cause and stoke hatred and resentment by deliberately killing 64 journalists. In the meantime, it's about 200, and media workers so far, bombing schools, hospitals, UN shelters, and 104 mosques and 3 churches so far. In the meantime, all mosques have been obliterated. Abducting doctors, abusing prisoners, taking innocent civilian prisoners and holding them without charge, humiliating the Palestinians in the West Bank, cutting off electricity and water, letting premature babies die, killing civilians who wave white flags and seek safety, using snipers to terrorize or kill doctors and medical personnel inside hospitals, targeting and bombing ambulances, preventing the passage of ambulances and the injured from being rescued, using children for shooting practice, targeting the homes and families of journalists, and desecrating mosques and cemeteries. 4. Cause Armageddon to fulfill biblical prophecy. A war of the circumcised in the Middle East, with evangelical Americans, the only circumcised Christians, if one can call them Christians, and Jewish Zionist soldiers on the other side, and Sunni and Shia Muslims on the other side, all of whom are circumcised, will result in Armageddon in Israel. And once this biblical prophecy is fulfilled, the doomsday adherents of the world's monotheistic religions will be willing and eager to accept the creation of an entirely new system, as that is what is foretold by their spiritual text. We have yet to get there. The US and Israel have deliberately left the world only 2 choices, either to be anti-Jews or pro-genocide, in order to get the war it wants. To ensure that it gets a war that fits the biblical description of Armageddon, neither the US nor Italy, Germany, and the UK, all of which are supplying Israel with weapons, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, have heeded a call by Amnesty International and the global public to impose a comprehensive arms embargo on Israel. Nor have the courts stopped governments from supplying arms to Israel, as witnessed by the recent decision by a Dutch court to dismiss a case brought by human rights groups against the delivery of F-35 fighter jet parts that are used by Israel to bomb Gaza. 2 years later, this remains the case. So far, despite perpetrating the most horrific crimes in modern history, no country, Muslim or otherwise, has taken the US-Israeli bait and come to the aid of Gaza with their armed forces or sent missiles flying towards Israel, other than the Houthis, which are merely a group. The US and Israel had hoped that Iran could be roped into the conflict so they would have the pretext they need to attack it. Despite signs that Russia, Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia are forging an alliance against Israel, judging by the bilateral meetings that have taken place between these nations recently, they have not attacked Israel either individually or as a group. Hezbollah has also remained relatively quiet despite being subjected to 30 attacks by Israel so far, to elicit a military response from them that could then be blamed on Iran as its alleged arms supplier. This, in the meantime, has happened, but Hezbollah's response has been weak and has been shut down. It could very well be that they are all working together and will not turn the tables on Israel so long as Gaza has not been wiped off the map and all Palestinians forced into Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon. 5. On the most basic level, the demolition of Gaza feeds the American and Israeli military machines by giving them the opportunity to use the old ammunitions they have in storage to make room for newly manufactured wear, thus keeping their armament industries in business. In addition, old ammunitions need to be used before they are made unreliable by moisture and corrosion, so they're being put to good use to demolish Gaza, just as Russia put its old ammunitions to good use to demolish the cities and towns of eastern Ukraine. By leveling the infrastructure, the population cannot return, be it in eastern Ukraine or Gaza. But while in Gaza, the intended goal is that ethnic cleansing and genocide, in eastern Ukraine, the goal is to keep the Ukrainians who fled to the EU from leaving the EU, since they are needed there to save the old continent from demographic collapse. As I showed in my paper, Fake War, a Real Suffering, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its geopolitical objectives. The difference of what is intended with these two populations is visible in the way the Ukrainians were received by the EU with open arms, while the Palestinians are wanted by no one and are instead being forced into an ever smaller area and bombed and starved to death. That demolition is one of the intended goals is demonstrated by the use of American-made 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs, which weigh 907 kilograms, the BLU-109, also called dumb bombs, which along with the 3,000-pound bombs, the M118, are demolition bombs. In addition, Israel has invaded Gaza with bulldozers that are used to scrape the pavement off the streets and make them impassable to cars, thus rendering entire cities unlivable. The Israeli army has most recently used bulldozers to destroy even the tents in which displaced Palestinians were living outside the Kamal Adwan hospital, burying alive dozens of sick and wounded people in the process. Since then, dozens of such atrocities have been committed. The proof is in the pudding, since the Israeli army has made 1.8 million of the 2.3 million Palestinians living in Gaza homeless. In the meantime, all 2.3 million Palestinians are homeless. That is 78% of the total population, in 2023 I'm talking about, by destroying their homes, hospitals, schools, mosques, stores, and streets. Clearly, that is no precision bombing, especially when considering that circa 19,000 people, in the meantime 60,000 people, have been confirmed killed. 70% of them women and children. 3.9% of the population of Gaza has therefore been either killed or injured in just 2 months of indiscriminate bombing by Israel, since there is no fighting happening in Gaza. In the meantime, more than 10% of the population has been killed or injured. Despite the Israeli and American propaganda, the reality is that the Palestinians have no army and no weapons with which to defend themselves. This is not a war, but an extermination. Now on to the long-term goals. 1. Contain China, India, Saudi Arabia, and the other Gulf states. Once the oil from the Persian Gulf stops flowing, both China and the Gulf states, which are two booming civilizations that have relegated the West to secondary status, will be contained, which will give the West the time to catch up and regain a preeminent position. India's development, which relies on fossil fuels, will also be stopped. The horrific crimes Israel commits in Gaza with American weapons and political diplomatic support have only elicited a military response from Yemen's Houthis so far, who are firing rockets at any ship that carries goods to and from Israel through the Red Sea. Shipping companies are already diverting their ships away from the Red Sea due to increased risks of attacks. Soon, the Red Sea Suez Canal corridor will be completely shut down. Oil giant BP has just announced that it has paused all tanker transit through the Red Sea, and the oil price has immediately surged, an indication of what is to come. Once the US and Israel manufacture a reason to attack Iran, the Strait of Hormuz will also be shut down, and none of the oil produced in the Middle East will be able to reach its customers in China, India, and beyond, therefore causing an energy crisis of global proportions, since 32% of the world's oil comes from the region. In the meantime, that has happened too. 2 days ago, the Iranians shut down the Hormuz canal, the Hormuz Strait. China and India will then be relegated to a single major oil supplier, Russia, who will charge any price it wants for its oil, therefore containing China and India by stalling their development, both for the benevolent geopolitical reason of ensuring that the remaining 50 years of oil last for as long as possible, as well as for the self-serving reason of preserving America's hegemony. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran, all of which are single commodity economies, will come to a complete stop once the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz is cut off. The construction of NEOM that puts Saudi Arabia with a foot into the 22nd century and at the forefront of all other civilizations will stop within days, and the narrow window of opportunity that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has to finish this new wonder of the world that is meant to serve as the survival ship of the rich in the post-oil era will close and may never reopen. Furthermore, if Russia and the United States, who despite appearances are working closer than ever before, decide to cripple China and India, they can do so by also shutting down the flow of oil and gas from Russia, just as they have done with the Nord Stream pipeline in September 2022 and with the Baltic Connector pipeline in October 2023, which will bring these two giant nations to a collapse within 3 months. Currently, 52.3% of China's total crude imports come from Russia and 47% from the Middle East, which would leave it with a 99.3% deficit. China's strategic petroleum stockpiles would last about 90 days. Russia makes up circa 50% of Indian oil imports, and the Middle East accounts for 44% of India's total crude oil imports, which would leave it with a deficit of 94%. India's strategic petroleum stockpiles would last about 74 days. If China and India collapse due to lack of oil and gas, they will suffer catastrophic loss of life, which will aid the depopulation effort and arguably increase the world's chances of survival into the future. I doubt the system will take it this far, but it will be possible for the West to cower these three civilizations at the same time without engaging them militarily, but simply by creating the conditions to deprive them of oil and gas for a few months. To what extent America's military-industrial complex and NATO will be allowed to cripple the three civilizations that challenge Western hegemony will reveal to the world who is really in charge of the US and the EU and what their strategy for the future truly is. 2. Cause widespread famine in sub-Saharan Africa, where the population is growing out of control and spilling into Europe by boat in a seemingly unstoppable wave of illegal migration. A war in the region would also give the West an excuse to stop all Mediterranean crossings, since the sea will be teeming with warships. The breadbasket of the world that Ukraine was before the Russian invasion is now entirely under the control of the machinations that America, Europe, and Russia are using to give the world the impression that they are at odds and engage in a proxy war. So far, they have successfully deceived the world and have closed the flow of grains through the Black Sea, causing widespread famine throughout the Middle East, but especially in the Horn of Africa, where Ethiopia and Kenya are suffering a crisis of food security, while Sudan and Somalia have succumbed to famine, mass migration, and war, and are more dependent on food aid than ever before. Currently, 21.7 million people across the Horn of Africa need food assistance, and 5.7 million children require treatment for acute malnutrition. Globally, about 9 million die of hunger every year, and the gap between the funding needs of the World Food Programme and the available resources is growing, which will lead to even more starvation in 78 countries around the world, where more than 333 million people are facing acute levels of food security in 2023. That number hasn't changed, by the way, but has risen. If the Red Sea, Suez Canal, and the Persian Gulf Strait of Hormuz sea lanes are closed by armed conflict, the entire continent of Africa will starve. This will ensure that Africa's population, that now numbers 1.4 billion, will not grow to 2.5 billion by 2050, which is what the UN projects. It is currently growing 3 times faster than the rest of the world and is projected to nearly double by 2050 and to double again by 2100 when it will reach 4.3 billion or 39% of the world's total. Even at current population levels, the flow of migrants from Africa to Europe via the Mediterranean is unstoppable and destabilizing. The Mediterranean has already become a graveyard for Africans who try to cross it by boat. In 2023 alone, more than 2,500 migrants have drowned and 186,000 have managed to reach Europe, causing discord within the EU. If Africa's population growth is not brought to a halt, these numbers will only grow and it will completely destabilize Europe. The West will not allow this to happen. Instead, it can now allow this to happen. Indeed, it cannot allow this to happen, and as it poses an existential threat to Europe. 3. Show the political and monetary ineptitude of the UN system and pave the way for its dissolution and replacement. A new age, the age of sustainability, necessitates a new system. The old system, erected at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 and the San Francisco Conference in 1945, is no longer adequate. It was created in the 20th century for the circumstances of that time. Aware that a new international architecture is necessary, Western powers are working in tandem to rush the end of the UN system by making all its institutions embarrassingly impotent and totally incapable of fulfilling their mandates, be it to preserve peace, increase prosperity, defend human rights, or punish crimes against humanity, to say nothing of reaching the 17 goals of the Sustainable Development Agenda. What will replace the UN, as it cannot be reformed, is anyone's guess, since no one talks about this publicly. My hope is that it will be replaced by a planetary well-being authority that is mandated with the authority to impose a population stabilization law globally, just as I have envisioned. Finally, it must be replaced by a global digital currency that is also under the control of a single global authority, preferably the same planetary well-being authority that will be in charge of the world's existential problems. If this new institutional infrastructure is to come into being, the old one has to be destroyed first, and the US and its allies are trying to carry out a controlled demolition of the old system, politically, economically, financially, and legally. In the meantime, 2 years later, we can see that this demolition of the UN system is complete. 4. Purge the US of Jewish control without having to repeat Europe's brutal experience, but simply by sending many of its 8 million Jews to Israel once their strangling control over American society is fully exposed and publicly challenged. The Jewish lobby has gained total control of the US Congress by buying the people's representatives with massive donations. And the military-industrial complex benefits from extorting $3.5 billion annually from taxpayers to send arms to Israel. The rest of the world watches with astonishment how every incumbent and aspiring American president grovels before AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, knowing that the Jewish lobby controls Congress, the media, and other key industries in the US and can make or break a president. The Jewish control over the economy, institutions, and destiny of America is far worse than the control they held over Germany, Poland, Romania, the UK, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and the Soviet Union in the 1930s. This being the case, America's Jews are being handed a rope with which to hang themselves. And in their boundless arrogance and hubris, they are tightening that rope around their necks from day to day by committing genocide in Gaza, ignoring the will of the international community, violating international law, making a mockery of the laws of war and humanitarian law, silencing free speech and freedom of conscience inside and outside Israel, muzzling the American people with false accusations of anti-Semitism, financially blackmailing universities to silence free speech on campuses, aggressively destroying the lives and careers of those who condemn Israel with baseless accusations of anti-Semitism, perverting the values and norms of American society and its foreign policy, discrediting the United States in the world as a mere puppet state of Israel and Capitol Hill as Israeli-occupied territory, threatening the world with nuclear war, presenting Israel apartheid state as a liberal democracy, and playing the victim of Palestinian aggression while they occupy, abuse, imprison, torture, and dispossess the 7 million Palestinians with a form of cruelty not seen since Nazi Germany. While the Jewish people are doing this to themselves by conducting a policy of ethnic cleansing in total defiance of the world's most basic norms and values, in order to gradually steal all land from the Palestinian people, as its growing territories clearly show, they are also being manipulated by the military-industrial complex and the international community to serve their geopolitical objectives. The end result will be that most American Jews will be forced to pack their bags and move to Israel, especially since they are needed there to keep the Jewish state secular. AIPAC will be declared a foreign agent and its political power annihilated. Jews in positions of political and economic power will be subjected to proportional representation. The American people will no longer be mutilated through circumcision, as 81% of them have been since America took in Europe's fleeing Jews, and Jewish wealth, like all wealth, will be confiscated and redistributed once a new world order is in place, since its concentration is the most unequal in history, and Jews play a particularly infamous role in this, as 30% of America's billionaires are Jewish, while Jews constitute only 2.4% of the population. 5. Bankrupt the US and pave the way for a global system and leadership that is independent of any nation state. The US is in effect committing financial suicide to facilitate the birth of a post-nation state system. Since 2020, America has added $25 trillion in debt, which is now 6 times what it was at the start of the 21st century, the largest it has been since World War II, and is projected to grow at about 1.3 trillion a year for the next decade. This is clearly an unsustainable level of spending, and deliberately so, as it is intended to hasten the financial collapse of the US and the dollar, which will pull down the entire dollar-based global financial system. Borrowing 7% of GDP year after year has put global debt on an unsustainable path, according to the International Monetary Fund, which warns that the US and China had driven a surge in debt levels that meant total public debt was on a course to approach the size of the entire global economy by the end of the decade. The US and China are working together to bankrupt the world, at which point a new political and financial system has to be created. The geopolitical objectives I have described are made inevitable by the bitter realization that humankind will run out of oil in just 50 years, and the vast majority of nations have neither the money nor the technology to change their entire energy production from fossil fuels to renewables in this short time. Consequently, the developed world will transit to renewables and save itself from collapse, while much of the developing world will not and will collapse as soon as oil becomes too expensive, which will happen in about 20 years, thus long before the world runs out of oil. The reason the UN system has framed this problem in climate change terms is to force the developed world to give enough money so that the developing world can also transit to renewables and avoid catastrophe. But the sums of money required are too large for this to happen, which incidentally is why Trump shut down the finance pipeline for the UN system and the developing world. The world would have to dedicate $4.5 trillion annually just for the energy transition at a time when the developed world can barely pay pensions and social entitlements anymore due to its old age dependency burdens. Furthermore, the population of the developing world is still growing rapidly, and consequently its energy needs are also growing. Transiting from fossil fuels to renewables while the population is still growing and industrialization is incomplete is like changing the diesel engine of a moving train. It is simply not possible. This being the case, we will see the total collapse of the developing world in the next 20 years and mass death. For once the oil runs out, everything stops. The destruction of Palestine and Armageddon in Israel are but the first 2 chapters of a system-wide plan to cause as much death as possible across the world among those who cannot be saved, even if humankind came together and worked as one to solve the dire existential problems we face. You have been warned. This, Poplio, is the situation. And you are still silent. Shame on you.